On this channel, I do a lot of tank content, but there's one video I've always been meaning to make, and with Endwalker being halfway over, I thought it was high time I asked which tank is the best in Endwalker. So, I poured over the data. I analyzed spreadsheets, graphs, charts, looking at every fine detail. It's Gunbreaker. Like, obviously, it's Gunbreaker. Now, there is more nuance to this all, in my opinion, so bear with me. Not only does Gunbreaker just tank really well through its great self-healing and mitigation, it also does the most damage, which is the most important thing in majority of progression scenarios. This is something I touched on in my last video, but I'm gonna elaborate. You see, FF14 fights are a race. They are a race against the enrage timer. Most fights have a hard enrage, and they are telegraphed in a way to where mechanics play out almost the exact same way every time. And with tanks specifically, you have your tank busters and just general boss damage as your main obstacle outside of other mechanics. However, even in the beginning of a tier, every tank has the mitigation and survivability necessary to make it through every fight without dying, meaning that the most important factor for any tank is the damage output. Especially in the early weeks, 1% wipes are common, and having a tank like Gunbreaker can help close that gap. Now, couple in the already high damage with some great survivability, and in Endwalker at least, Gunbreaker is nuts. And speaking purely objectively, I think Gunbreaker is Endwalker's best tank. However, that could always change. We just had the Paladin rework, but we won't really know for sure how much that does until the next Savage tier in a few months. Now, yes, Gunbreaker is doing well, but how does that reflect in actual player numbers? Well, first off, there is no definitive way to know just how many players use any job. Add in the fact that players can swap between jobs freely in this game, and as far as player numbers go, the water is very muddy. However, I will do my best using FF logs. So there are two different categories in my mind. There is progression, which is Savage, leaving extremes and ultimates as sort of extra content, being content you don't get gear from. And with ultimates in particular, that's content you're doing after Savage progression. But what I found is that when it comes to Savage progression, the higher DPS specs have the most parses. Now, as time goes on and players get more gear, the lower DPS specs find more usage. That's because it's just easier to meet those DPS checks of gear. Now with extremes, at least the newest one, which released outside of a new Savage tier, Warrior, the tank with the lowest DPS, actually has the most parses. This is most likely because this extreme released post-progression for a lot of players, meaning that the DPS checks to be a lot easier to reach, making lower DPS tanks more usable. And this is somewhat reflected with ultimates. With the Omega protocol, it's still way too early to tell. In fact, there are so few parses for any ultimate. These are the hardest and simultaneously least played encounters in the game. But at least in DSR, in 6.3, Warrior has the most parses, followed by Dark Knight. Dark Knight in particular is popular with this fight because of the amount of magic damage. So when it comes to it, although I truly believe that Gunbreaker is the best overall tank in Endwalker, this is really only reflected in progression rating. Now, why is this? Well, as stated before, it's gear. The more gear you, and more importantly, the more gear your static gets, the easier it is to make those DPS checks. To summarize, Gunbreaker is the best progression tank in Endwalker. In those early weeks of the raid tiers, when teams are still getting gear to meet damage checks, Gunbreaker, along with the other highest DPS tank, most likely Dark Knight, are going to be the most popular picks. However, as the tier goes on and you get more gear, you have the freedom to pick any tank you want, as the limited data reflects. Unless it's Paladin. People really do not like Paladin. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. Check out this one on screen, and take care.